Good morning. Before I officially call this meeting to order, I'd like to give a few minutes to outgoing committee member Mark Oyas. Mark Oyas was a long-serving member of our committee, and for my tenure, he's helped with institutional knowledge of this audit committee and bringing it back from a vacant department to what it is today. Mr. Oyas, did you want to say a few words?
Chair Palmisano and the members of the Audit Committee, Auditor Tetzel and your staff and staff here. For the record, my name is Mark Oyas. I'm a resident of the city of Minneapolis, and I also operate a business here. Normally, I'm quite glib extraneously, but I can't even say the word, so I thought I'd read this. So bear with me, because there's some things I just don't want to miss. As an outgoing individual who happens to be the outgoing member of this committee, I thought it would be appropriate to make a few outgoing remarks, so thanks for indulging me, Chair. It's been an honor to serve on this committee representing the good people of this wonderful city. It's been a unique privilege to participate as an inaugural member of what I believe is a very important function in any organization, especially in government setting where the public trust is the ultimate definition of success. Some thank yous are owed by me, beginning with the Minneapolis Park and Recreation Board, who nominated me to serve as its representative during the Audit Committee startup. Lost in ancient history is the fact that my mother had a long and proud career at the Park Board. Because she still has her hooks into me from the great beyond, I think it's nice that I could do one thing to make her proud. I am also grateful to Mayor Hodges, who extended my service when Commissioner Tabb came on board. Seeing this committee seeing the shape this audit committee is in today provides great closure and pride. In spite of the platitudes that were uttered from this dais up here when the original ordinance was adopted, most people who follow these things knew there would be challenges getting all of the various stakeholders to row in the same direction. While some of the cynics were not disappointed, the service of our first auditor and my fellow public representatives should not be discounted. I would be remiss as the last one standing among them from that era not to acknowledge Magdi Masad, Stephanie Woodruff, and Daryl Ellsworth. Each of them is highly regarded in the field of internal audit, locally and internationally. The contributions they made here should not be soon forgotten, and I'm proud that I was able to put this into a public setting. It's been my honor to work with many outstanding professional staff that keeps this committee moving in the right direction. Thank you to the City Attorney's Office, including Ms. Siegel, Mr. Ginder, and especially Ms. Trammell. I don't think she suffers fools very gladly, and I appreciate her making an exception in my case. Thank you to the City Clerk's Office, which puts the support in terms of support staff. Mr. Casey Carl, fairly new to his job himself, stepped in to provide much needed guidance to Mr. Masad and the committee as the reality of resistance set in. Mr. Peter Ebenet has been a critical addition to assist the audit team through the hurdles large and small. And of course, I tip my hat to the wonderful committee clerks. If legal is the duct tape, they are the glue. I have worked with this crew before, but you really see a pro's pro when you are depending on them to keep the canoe above the falls. Irene Casper, you are the bestest. You thought you could pawn this thing off on Jackie Hansen, who is also magnificent, but you could not get this audit gum off your shoe, and I'm glad you came back. The notion of independent internal audit would have disappeared into the bureaucratic ether had it not been for the strong support of then CFO Patrick Bourne and city coordinators Paul Ossen and Spencer Kronk. I have not met the city's new CFO, but from the Council of Municipal Finance Professionals I know and respect, his expertise and integrity puts him in the same rarefied air as Mr. Bourne, which means good things for both the taxpayers and this audit function. I leave this, as I said, with a feeling of closure. The last concrete thing I would ask the committee to consider as you begin anew with Mr. David Fisher, another one of those rarefied air people whose background and experience will serve everyone well. I urge you to form this is the one thing I want to leave you with. I urge you to form some kind of ongoing human resources subcommittee, whether it's formal or ad hoc. This group would essentially navigate the tricky path between a truly independent entity and the practical need to work within the city personnel system. They would make certain reviews and raises are on track. They would assist the chair if complaints are ever made regarding the conduct of any of our audit employees, especially in matters regarding the auditor. I also think it's critical that at least one committee member participates in an exit interview of any audit employee. I've advocated for exit interviews specifically in the past, And I know that for a fact that we could have learned a great deal and prevented considerable heartache had we heard from some team members on the way out, way early in our inception. When I was first appointed, one of the council members who was also slated to serve on this committee asked me rather incredulously, "What do you know about internal audit?" Now, this was a person with whom I'd actually worked for a number of years, and the only significant difference between our backgrounds is that that person had an election certificate and a case of hubris that too often accompanies possessing one. It's too easy for insiders to make, or worse, fall for excuses regarding sloppy internal controls or mission drift. Working relationships to expand to friendships, that's human nature, and we lose our impartial instincts. It's imperative that the lid on this terrarium here get lifted and people look at internal controls through a different lens. I encourage all of you involved in this endeavor to reread the enabling ordinance regularly. It really does help with clarity. So thank you for your wisdom and willingness to reboot, Madam Chair. Independent internal audit is functioning as it should. You have an outstanding leader in Mr. Tetzel, and he has assembled a winning staff team. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you. This city is blessed with hardworking employees, and I've been reminded of that very often over the last 6 years. Internal audit is not a cudgel, but it's a tool whose value to maintain the public trust is very needed. Stay dedicated, stay vigilant. Mark out.
Thank you, Mark, for those comments and for your many years of service to this committee and also for your insights. I'm now going to call to order this meeting of the Minneapolis Audit Committee for Tuesday, May 24th. My name is Lene Palmisano, and I'm the chair of this committee. With me at the dais are the following committee members: Councilmember John Quincy, Mr. Scott Neal, and Mr. David Fisher. Committee members Alondra Cano and Anita Tabb could not be here today, but please let the record reflect that we have a quorum. Colleagues, as you can see, we have several items on the agenda today. Since we have a couple items of organizational business, I'd like to make a motion that we amend the order of this agenda. Specifically, I'd like to move that items 5 through 7 directly precede our unfinished business. More specifically, I propose that we take up items 5, 6, and 7 between items 2 and 3. So I will make a motion to adopt the agenda as amended. Do I have a second?
Second.
It's been moved and seconded to adopt the agenda as amended. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? The ayes have it, and this agenda is adopted. First, we need to accept the minutes from our last meeting on January 26th, so I will move adoption of those minutes. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? The ayes have it, and those minutes are adopted. Oh, I'm sorry, abstaining?
Should I push it? Yes, Madam Chair. David Fisher. I will abstain since I wasn't at the meeting.
Moving on then to item number 5 on our agenda, simply to welcome the newest member of our committee. Mayor Hodges has appointed David Fisher to a term expiring December 31st of 2018. As the appointment letter from the mayor states, Mr. Fisher currently serves as the executive director of the Corporate Institute at the University of Minnesota's Law School. He also teaches at the law school in areas of corporate law and practice, clinical studies, and leadership development. He's of counsel with Larkin Hoffman, Daly, and Lindgren, where his specialties include business organization and corporate and board governance. Previously, he's held positions as general counsel, vice president for international, or business general manager with the Pillsbury Company, ADC Telecommunications, and G&K Services, and he is the founder and former chief executive officer of Internet Destination Sales System. Mr. Fisher's areas of expertise that will serve the committee particularly well will include corporate governance and compliance programs, as well as the functions of boards and committees, from composition and charters to codes of ethics and fiduciary duties. So, Mr. Fisher, welcome. Are there any remarks you'd like to make?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate it. There really isn't much more to say in addition to what you've already mentioned. I do want to mention, though, that I have served this city off and on for 40 years. First on the Minneapolis Civil Rights Commission, appointed by Mayor Fraser, the Charter Commission, appointed by Mayor Sales Belton, and CLIC, appointed by Mayor R.T. Ryback. So this is the 4th mayor now I've been working with, and I've also served on the Metropolitan Council, and then served as the Minnesota Commissioner of Administration, leaving it in good order for the city coordinator to take over when he came aboard to take that same job. And I also have been heavily involved in Minneapolis Public Schools referendum. And if there's nobody here that doesn't know that there's a referendum request going down the ballot, I'm informing you now that that is being done. And I appreciate the opportunity to serve the city once again. Thank you.
Thank you. Next on our agenda is the selection of a new committee vice chair since Mr. Oyas is termed off. I submit the name of Scott Neal to fill that role. He was appointed to the committee by City Council in 2014, and he's been an integral part of our committee's growth and of our audit department. So I'll make a motion that Mr. Scott Neal serves as this committee's vice chair for the remainder of his term, which right now ends December 31st of 2016. Do I have a second? It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of the motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the motion has been approved. Congratulations, Vice Chair Scott Neal.
Pleased to serve. I did not vote. Thank you.
All right, let's return to our unfinished business and take up item number 3. It is the Employee Separation Internal Audit Report, and here to present is Mr. Will Tetzel. Mr. Tetzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is Will Tetzel. I'm the Director of Internal Audit here at the City of Minneapolis. In the January Audit Committee meeting, the audit team was given direction to do an analysis into employee separation. And I would like to talk about that at this point. I think I want to clarify before I even begin to say that this is a much more complicated matter than I initially thought it would be. There are 25 labor agreements, there are 2 civil service commissions, there's the city ordinance, and there's policies, both written and unwritten, within the city that all deal with how to accrue, use sick leave and vacation leave, and what happens when someone separates employment with the city in that regard. I think another important thing to point out here is that in looking through the League of Minnesota Cities HR manual, one thing that they point out is that state and federal laws do not mandate any paid leave benefits, with exceptions like military leave. However, they do often dictate equality in how paid leave programs are offered and executed. This is an important note that we'll get to here shortly. I'm sure that paid sick and vacation leave over time have accumulated into all of these different bodies of work, all of these different policies, all of these different uses. And from an employee's perspective, these are valuable, important benefits. Some of the ways that the city has structured these benefits leaves an inherent risk that employees try to maximize those benefits, whether perceived or not. And that's what I'd like to talk about here today, is the risk in people trying to maximize their vacation and sick leave benefits by circumventing some of the intentions or objectives of those benefits in the first place. So let's go through the risks here. These are for both sick and vacation leave. Because when people terminate employment with the city or leave the city, depending on the labor agreement they have, depending on whether they're appointed or non-repped, there's different ways that their sick and vacation leave balances are handled. If an employee retires, and there's qualifications to that, you have to be at the city for a certain amount of time or be of a certain age, then you can get a severance package, and that severance package is 50% of your accrued sick leave balance paid out at the daily rate that you retire at. And you have to have 480 hours of sick leave to get that. So if you had 470 hours of accrued sick leave, you would get nothing. If you had 500 or 1,000 or whatever, you'd get 50% of that value. I'm not sure that people understand the severance package very well. So there's definitely an opportunity here overall that employees are communicated regularly these benefits that they have. So the first risk that I put here is that there's an unwritten rule, or maybe it's just a pattern of behavior that employees shouldn't run out their sick and vacation leave at the end of their employment with the city. And there's a couple risks to the city. One, and it goes back to the point I made earlier, a department head can allow this or disallow this at their discretion. And this points back to this idea of preferential treatment. So if one department head in a certain department allows someone to run out their sick and vacation leave, but not in another, then the state, I think, can become concerned in the rights that employees have in their benefits being equitably executed. Another point here, and because I'm an auditor and like to work with numbers a little bit, I did a hypothetical calculation on what it actually costs the city to keep an employee on vacation rather than to pay them out for any balances that they're due and let them go on their way. So I'll try to set this up as briefly as I can, but if, hypothetically speaking, if we talk about an employee who's got a $75,000 a year salary, who's on the city's health benefits program, and who's been here long enough so they accrued the maximum amount of vacation. Sick is the same for everyone. The difference between paying them out that lump sum and not is about $250 a day. So if someone had their 50 days of their maximum accrued vacation of 50 days, that would be about $12,500 additional cost to the city in just para contributions, healthcare benefits, and additional sick and vacation leave that those employees accrue during those 10 weeks. And there's likely other potentially indirect costs. Another aspect of that is that this can sometimes prevent a department from backfilling that position. It can prevent a department from offboarding, especially if there's little or no notice given. And so it leaves the city in kind of a sticky situation. The second, and I think this is an unintended consequence of how the rules are set up, is that if an employee decided, well, I want to run my vacation out, I want to use that because I don't want to lose anything. There's certain groups of employees that upon separating with the city, they might get 50% of their vacation balance put into a healthcare savings account and 50% paid out. Well, maybe they don't want that. So they say, well, I'm going to schedule and take all my vacation, and then I'll just quit at the end of it. So I'll sort of circumvent the intent of all this and get all that benefit that I need. Again, this leaves the city in that position where we're probably paying for more benefits and more para contributions, et cetera, than we need to be. And two, when a department doesn't have notice that someone's deciding to separate employment, it puts them in a tough position, because in an institution like this where you have long tenured employees, they typically start to take on more tasks than what they were originally hired for in that job description. So a lot of times you might have someone that's been here for 10 or 20 years or 30 years that can do far more than bringing on a replacement in the interim. One, because they just know everything. Two, there's a lot of practices here that, like any other organization, aren't memorialized. So they might do things that no one else knows how to do, what to do. So we get into some situations like that. When it comes to sick days, because of that severance, there's a couple scenarios that I wanted to call out. One of them being someone who realizes they won't be able to accrue that minimum 480 hours of sick leave to get their severance. And so instead, they just start to take more sick days than they actually need, because to them, that has monetary value. That's some benefit. On the other side of the spectrum, you have someone that that has that, but they don't want to lose that balance. So if they're sick or ill or shouldn't be in the office because they're contagious or not feeling well enough to be productive or do their duties, they could come to work because they don't want to use that sick time and lose that severance payout. I don't think the decisions that the city made were intended to penalize anyone for this. It's just the way that all of these decisions have been culminated that it puts us in this situation. And from our office's standpoint, I think it's a good time to reevaluate where we are and what we can do moving forward. Leave and sick benefits are a very valuable benefit to city employees. Sometimes they're often more generous than what you can get in the private sector, and that's because we don't get a lot of benefits that private sector employees do. There's no stock options, there's no bonuses, there's no things like that, and so it is an important benefit to city employees, and we're definitely not advocating that those be decreased. Just that it might be due time to look at this large swath of labor agreements, policies, procedures, and practices, and see what is the best fit both for the city from a risk and liability standpoint, that also keeps employees engaged and happy with what we're doing moving forward. And so that's outlined here a little bit. Another thing is, from a city employee's perspective, it can be hard to gather all this information so you can plan for separation with the city or retirement. It can be difficult for supervisors to understand all the different rules and nuances of requests that employees might make for sick leave, vacation leave, when to use it, how to use it. There's sick leave donation. There's so many little tangents on this topic that might be worth considering to see, is there a better way to establish this program that incentivizes people to use vacation for what it's intended for, to get away from work, to spend time with your family, to attend to your personal affairs, to take a break, to decompress, and for sick leave to not come to work when you're sick, to be able to stay home and get better quicker and not put some of your coworkers or the public at risk of whatever illness that you might have. To maintain the objective of that and also please the employees and hopefully decrease the risk that the city faces in this situation.
Thank you, Mr. Tetzel. I imagine there are going to be a number of questions from this committee, and I just want to start off by saying having access to paid time away from work for health and wellness reasons for employees and those that rely on them is critically important to a city that works for everyone. Thank you for your comments about that. This is a big topic on a federal level, and it's obviously, to address the elephant in the room, a big topic on our own municipal level as well. I'm very proud to see that we offer this in this kind of way, but this isn't as much about that. This is about how that benefit of accrued sick time, to me more accrued sick time versus vacation time, but how that gets treated, or rather cashed out at the end of employment, and the financial liability that is incurred because of that, and the risk that we hold as a city. Mr. Neal, do you have a question?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have a couple of questions. One, from the start, Mr. Tetzel, you've titled this a risk analysis, so it's not really an audit per se of comparing what we do in practice compared to what we do in policy, right? So you've given a pretty good description here of the city's policies and how we understand them, but there's no analysis to show, like, for instance, how many employees get separated and don't get their sick leave paid out. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Mr. Neal, thank you for the question. Correct. In contemplating how to tackle this body of work, I first started thinking about all the data that we had in HR and in finance and in other places, and how to use these numbers to prove a point. but I don't think the data tells the whole story, especially when people act in a way that isn't anticipated or isn't intended in some of these programs. And so I wanted to, I call this an analysis because I'm not saying that anyone's doing anything wrong. The message that I'm trying to get across is we've got ourselves in this quandary of sorts that we've created this sort of maze of rules and practices across the city where that might not typically match to maybe a private organization where they have one sick leave plan and they have one vacation plan and it's easy to manage and monitor. Here it's much more difficult. And so we didn't want to sort of point blame that people weren't managing this risk appropriately because it's really difficult to manage. And it's difficult to manage because of all the ways and all the policies that have been set up over time.
Madam Chair, just a couple more. One of the metrics that I think a lot of cities use when they're judging the size of these balances is hours versus days. I'm just curious. You use days throughout the risk analysis. Is that what's in city policy, or do you see it listed as hours?
Yeah, there's no state policy. The way the city talks about vacation and sick is, and I think it's even on people's paychecks, that vacation is listed in number of days and sick in number of hours. And so when they with the severance, it's 480 hours minimum of sick time. And so I think it's, and it might be, and I might defer to Susan Trammell, it might be because you can't take partial vacation days, but maybe you can take partial sick days.
Okay.
And so from a granularity perspective, I'm sure they're accrued and calculated vacation on an hourly basis, but perhaps you can't use them until you have like a full day's vacation. And that might be the reason for that.
Somewhere in the city's audit, I'm sure there's a number that tells us what the unfunded liability is for the accrued vacation and sick leave. Do you have a sense of what that number is?
I'm sure it's really high,
Okay.
but I don't have a sense. I can get back to you on that.
That's all. Thank you.
Just to be clear, this was a follow-up, so this is an analysis, but that is part of why there aren't any hard numbers here. Mr. Tetzel, in your informal investigation and analysis of this, is something like cashing out enormous banks of sick time, does that happen? And if so, to what extent? Is it very unusual or occasional? I mean, do we have a sense of the incident rate of that?
The city has a program where they'll buy back sick leave at a certain percentage, depending on how much you have. So I think there's 3 thresholds, and if you meet those thresholds, the city will, I think, give you 70, 80, 90, or 100% of the value of those down to that next threshold, I believe. So every year when they notice someone that is going to meet that threshold, they send them a notice to say you're eligible to sell some of this time back to the city. I don't think there's probably only a few handfuls of people that are up there, I would say. But if you think of the thousands of employees that we have and the amount of sick time that exists, sick and vacation, can be a pretty large number.
One of the things I learned from this analysis is that I think it's crazy that sick time is paid out at a higher rate than PTO or vacation time. You gave us a general sense of how many people sold sick time back. But I just want to be clear. I think that in this day and age, sick time is there to be used when people are ill or when they need to care for somebody that's ill. And this sort of flies in the face of what we're trying to do here, on a municipal level, even that our own employees not only get sick time, but sometimes accrue such a mountain of it that it becomes a commodity. It should be there for everyone when they need it. And so I wonder, and one of the most troubling pieces here was the informal policy, because to me that seems like it leads to preferential treatment and inequitable treatment between different employees based on their relationship they have with their managing supervisor. So if this is an unwritten rule, is it a rule that can be enforced, Mr. Tetzel?
Well, the rule is unwritten. I don't know how universally understood it is, but caveat is that it's ultimately up to the department head. And so whatever the department head decides can override that unwritten rule or that informal rule.
So if we were to then write it down, perhaps it should, or not write it down and recognize that there is no real rule here, should it not be enforced at every level across the organization so that there's evenness, like the Minnesota League of Cities states in their analysis?
I think that would decrease the risk of us exhibiting preferential treatment, or their perception of that. It would be really difficult to identify, to detect until it was potentially over with. Because of how a supervisor even handles it, if they really wanted an employee to have that ability, then they would wait until the employee comes back and separates to do some of the formal HR processes on removing them from the employee roster. So it's difficult to enforce, it's difficult to detect, and it's difficult to correct, because a lot of times we learn after the fact a lot of these, which I think is a compelling reason for designing something that doesn't incentivize people to learn how to circumvent this and turn these balances into commodities, but rather use them for what they're objectively there for, which is to get away from work from time to time, to spend time outside of work, to be able to relax and rest when they're sick.
I think that it's important that we consider what we might be able to put in place such that if you're not sick, that it's not there for you to use. Seems like that would reduce our liability, but mostly this practice, this as being common practice and unspoken, seems to make a mockery of those fighting hard to gain their first ever access to sick time across our city. Are there any other questions from committee members? Mr. Fisher?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Ms. Tetzel, I'm wondering, and I'm still on a learning curve here, but you state that vacation and sick leave are memorialized by 25 labor unions and Civil Service Commission Rules 16 and 17 in city ordinance. Do these particular provisions, do they impact the manner in which vacation and sick leave are paid out? Are they pretty uniform in their application? Or I should say, are they pretty uniform in what they say the application should be?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, there's variability. There are certain, to give you an example, there is a certain labor agreement that that says you can accrue more above that 50 hours or those 50 days of vacation during the year, but at year end, whatever balance you have above 50 gets taken away from you. Where others, you stop at 50, you don't over accrue. You don't get past that point. Some of them have different payout choices. It's hard to compare all of them because there's so many, but there is variation in there.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Tetzel, in order to change some of those practices, it's a little bit more than just the department head making a decision. The city would have to amend or negotiate some of these labor agreements to make more uniformity among the practices. Is that correct?
Madam Chair, Mr. Fisher, I think so. Yes. Yeah. And I think that's another reason why this is probably not a good audit. Rather, points of consideration. I don't think it's appropriate for me to tell HR to go renegotiate all of the labor contracts. That's a hefty and long, difficult process. But I think we can move the needle, and we can find a balance where the city is comfortable and employees are comfortable, and try to set a standard there. There are some non-rep employees or appointed employees that the city can simply just rewrite the ordinance. Whether that's appropriate or not, still, that's not a decision for me to make.
Mr. Tetzel, so it seems that in particular to some of these labor agreements that the city has set ourselves up to be duped because we're actually, for example, when you store up vacation time that gets paid out at less than sick time, you're incentivized to work to maximize that perceived benefit. I think that some of these guidelines can warrant review. I don't know that they work well. And it sounds like from some of your analysis work and some of your conversations that it borderlines on being exploited. Mr. Tetzel, did you find examples of exploitation about this at the end of employment based on your conversations with people around the enterprise?
Madam Chair, we might have it backwards. So severance, which is comprised of sick leave, is paid out at 50%. Vacation can be paid out 100%. There's times when it can be half of it can be put in a health care savings account and the other half a cash payment. Because of that balance, I think the risk would be that someone is on sick leave and could decide to use some vacation hours. And I think if you're if you're sick and you take a vacation day, that's not really exploiting the rules so much. If it were the other way around, perhaps, but
Okay.
I don't think it's. I think it's harder to talk about exploitation from that perspective.
Thank you, Mr. Neal.
Madam Chair, I want to see if I understand that comment, though, because I think maybe this is where you were going, that because sick leave doesn't have a cap on the accrual, you could end your career with 1,000 hours or 2,000 hours of sick leave and get 1,000 of those paid out.
Right.
Whereas you might end your career at a max with 400 hours of vacation leave, right? So in that sense, you could have a sizable sick leave payout. Is that what you were meaning? Okay.
Mr. Neal, yes, and also just what I meant by the exploitation piece is that people informally retire, but then they burn it all out while they are still active employees, and that has different amounts of risks and financial impacts to the city.
And Madam Chair, if I may, if I'm not mistaken, I think there are labor agreements where employees are allowed to burn out their vacation at the end of their employment. If they choose not to, the city also has to calculate how much extra vacation they would have earned in that time and pay them for that as well.
And
So,
that's in a labor agreement.
I think that's in a labor agreement, if I'm correct.
Also, Mr. Tetzel, for those employees who feel like they can't take time off, you kind of alluded to it in part of your discussion, they end up storing up all kinds of vacation time, only 50 days of which get to roll over year after year, so perhaps they lose it. Would we be good to try to put pressure on supervisory managers to make sure that those employees are taking their vacation in those smaller increments year after year? Like, what kind of a risk from your perspective? What's your assessment of something like that?
Thank you, Madam Chair. One thing that auditors appreciate about people taking vacation is that hopefully someone backfills that position and finds out that something doesn't seem right. And a lot of times when you hear stories about fraud, it's because someone never took vacation, they never left, they were the only one that did this, they had total control over it, and then a tragedy happened, they were gone, and someone else had to step in and saw, wow, this isn't right, this isn't working right. I don't know if it's fair for supervisors to force employees to take smaller pieces or smaller chunks of time, but I would say maybe on the flip side, if an employee feels like they don't even have the opportunity because of their duties and maybe their supervisor not approving vacation time, that they have some sort of rights, and the supervisor of the city has some sort of obligation to make sure that we can accommodate as much vacation time that they accrue during a year that they have the ability to take it. So if someone is extremely busy and their job is very important and hardly anyone else knows how to do it, and they almost feel obligated to be there all the time, is that equitable? That we couldn't even afford to give them as much vacation time as they accrue, and that we in concept intend on them being able to use throughout the year?
Thank you, Mr. Tetzel. This is a complex landscape, and as Mr. Fisher acknowledges, it's very much intertwined and intermixed with different labor agreements. Any other questions or comments from committee? May I have a motion to receive this report, to direct staff to publish it, and to refer the item to City Council?
So moved.
And also with that, thank you for the second. I want to explain something. Audit in this construct, Audit is in charge of being the watchdog for the city. We receive reports, and when it rises to the level of affecting the risk that the city takes on, we send it to council for their consideration. Audit can't do this job by itself, so that is my intent in referring this item to City Council as a whole. We also sometimes refer reports to specific committees of council, as you'll see later in our agenda. So it's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of this motion, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed? The ayes have it, and the report will be received, and staff will publish it, and this will go to council. Thank you. Next on the agenda is item number 4. Following our previous committee meeting on January 26th, we met in a closed session to complete the performance review of our internal auditor, Director Will Tetzel. That summary, I believe, is before you. That summary is not yet before you, but Irene is making sure that it is. I believe and have worked with our city attorney to ensure that this passes our tests of being specific enough to avoid vagueness, but also keeps private matters that are personnel matters private. We were pleased to see that as we were looking for advisory opinions on how to appropriately put the right amount of information into this summary, we came upon Mr. Fisher's former advisory opinions in Minnesota IPAD functions. So I also want to acknowledge that Mr. Fisher was not part of this committee when we did this performance review, but may I have a motion to receive the summary of the committee's conclusion regarding the performance evaluation of our internal auditor, and to publish this for the record?
So moved.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor of this motion, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? This motion carries. Moving ahead to item number 8, the next item on our agenda is an internal audit report of the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department's neighborhood programming and support. Here again to present first is Will Tetzel. Mr. Tetzel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As you remember, in 2015, the Internal Audit Department was given staff direction to assist the Neighborhood and Community Relations Department in an evaluation that they wished to have on their neighborhood programming and support. Originally, this was a budget item in their department. It was moved over to internal audit. I think NCR agreed that was a wise decision, that having the evaluation done independently by the audit department would remove any subjectivism that might be inherent in there. Today, I'm going to go through very briefly the findings from the consultants that did this body of work, and I'm going to be brief because this will go to another committee meeting for a more in-depth discussion. In general, this body of work is difficult to summarize and actually to execute. The approach that these consultants took was to do a variety of surveys, focus groups, questionnaires to neighborhood associations, council members, boards and staff of the neighborhood groups, and try to culminate and theme up some ideas on some of the topics that we put in this RFP to come to some of these conclusions. And so they had 5 findings, if you will. The first, the NCR meets the overall expectations outlined in the framework for the future. Second, that they are providing assistance to neighborhood groups. There's some factors in there where neighborhoods feel like they need more assistance in some areas, but I don't think there was an overwhelming amount of information that made us think that they weren't providing an acceptable level of assistance to neighborhood groups. That they were facilitating the NCEC, but there was some further opportunities and clarifications there because of the structure of it. That there was some opportunities to continue to enhance communication with City Council so that they best understand what NCR is doing, the value that's providing their neighborhoods. And then there were some topics on the NCR department staff and the NCEC organization. Overall, I think the body of work is very robust. The difficulty that we had was the testimony that these consultants got from neighborhood groups, from their staff and boards, is sometimes in a nature that's somewhat adversarial to the city, because NCR, to an extent, can keep neighborhoods in check, for things that they need to do. So the challenge that we gave the consultants was, where there is data that would either support or negate these themes and these findings that they put together, that we try to aggregate that and match it up to the survey results and the results they had from focus groups. Because as you know, and it's human nature, when you invite a group of people to come to talk about something, typically the people that have the most to say are the ones that show up. And typically, maybe that's not fair, but sometimes it's the most vocal opponents that might wish to get their word out. And so we wanted to make sure that when there was a theme, that there was data behind it to either support that or to say that NCR is doing as much as they can in how they can help, or what they can do with neighborhoods to be able to achieve that.
Okay. We typically offer the courtesy of the floor also to those that were audited. And I understand an extensive dialogue is planned before your home committee, the Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee. But I offer the floor for just a couple words here for Director David Rubador, who's here with us from NCR, with Robert Blinn and Robert Thompson. Mr. Rubador, do you have any comments?
Madam Chair and committee members, thank you for the opportunity to speak this morning. I just had a couple of comments and words to say this morning. First, I want to start off by saying thank you to Councilmember Palmisano and Councilmember Gordon for their leadership in helping to provide this audit of our neighborhood programming. It's been very helpful. I also wanted to also thank Mr. Tetzel for his support. As he mentioned, in this process, a lot of times we're dealing with individual testimony, and really taking that kind of information and raising it up to a level where we can really look at our systems and the types of supports that we're offering, and be able to identify some improvements about how we can do our work better and to be more responsive to our constituents and our stakeholders. So thank you to everybody that's helped with this. I think we landed on a really good report that we will be taking forward. I just wanted to mention a couple things about where this information is going to go. Based on the committee's support today in forwarding this on, this will go to the City Council's Health, Environment, and Community Engagement Committee, and scheduled for later in June, where we'll have a more robust discussion around some of the policy issues that were actually raised in this. We will also take this to the NCEC after that to talk to them about some of the recommendations and the findings that are included in here. And then on an administrative level, the NCR management team has been working with the consultant and with Mr. Tetzel for quite some time on this audit. A number of the changes that were kind of being identified in this process are already underway. Some more will be coming. One of the things that we are doing right now is we're reorganizing our staff.